Oh, I have one quick thing to add on the data collecting. When we were talking about the VGS, I sent a text to Delta Spain real quick, and he says that the VGS doesn't have a PFC right now. He's working on it to make it efficient into the system, but it is something that can be added into a template, relatively simple until he has that. So that's just kind of a side.
Oh, good. Well, hopefully when he adds it, he'll have a mechanism to not just provide a place for the rating, but to also tell the story, because in the end, at least I'm convinced of this, the real chief benefit of this is the story that you learn, the indications of what is broken, if something is broken, what needs to be repaired, what could still progress to provide more resilience and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's good stuff to know. I'll make sure to tell him to have a big box for notes.
Yes, yes, absolutely. The form in the new version, Dickert et al., is a much longer form with much more place to write notes than the previous form was. So the next story I want to tell is really not my story. It's a story that has been put together by Carol Evans. She's a fisheries biologist just about to retire from the Elko district of the Bureau of Land Management. And she's been in the Elko district since, I believe it was 1986 when she came. And so she's been there for a long time and had a chance to, because of time and place and because she was paying attention, tell the story about how the management across the district has been changing through the last few decades, and it's a very interesting story. Her subtitle is The Practical Application of PFC, but the main headline is Managing Livestock Grazing or Riparian Recovery in Northeast Nevada. So it's a story in progress. It's not done yet. We're still learning things. This is, I believe this is Dixie Creek, and there's things happening on this creek that are head scratchers, and we're still learning a lot. And of course, as systems change, the need for management changes as well. The story basically is one of phases. There was a documentation phase back in the late 70s where people began to have the trepidation to even think that they ought to be looking at an area next to water. I know that when I took range management, my first class in the 70s, I was using an older than that textbook, but in that textbook it said that you should never look at the utilization level anywhere close to water. Any place close to water is a sacrifice zone. Well, maybe that makes sense when you're talking about a trough on a stable upland site. But when you're talking about a riparian area that may be providing 3/4 or habitat for 3/4 of the vertebrate species in that landscape, sacrifice zone began not to work as a socially acceptable concept in the 70s, and so they began to document. Once we had FLPMA and National Forest Management Act and all the other environmental laws of the 70s, people began to document what was going on in riparian areas. And then there was a recognition and protection phase. That was then followed by a how to graze phase, and at this point in time, they're thinking on a much bigger scale. So documentation phase, you know, a lot of streams look basically like this. They may have had the potential to grow willows, but they weren't growing willows. They were sort of wide, shallow, dished out streams that were not providing high-quality fish habitat, and since Carol's a fisheries biologist, she's certainly paying attention to that. We may have initially thrown up some exclosures. You can see an exclosure in the background. That was the protection phase. But on the outside of the exclosure, we had the cows hanging out in the bottoms of the valleys, close to the water where it's flat, where they could maybe get a nibble of green feed. Even if they weren't getting enough to eat, it was at least green in the hot part of the summer. And that protection phase is what we came to recognize as not being adequate. We can't fix the West with those small exclosures. So there are a lot of photographs that look sort of like this. We have a protected area on the inside where we see that things can obviously get better when we protect them, and at the outside area we have a pretty trampled looking riparian area that is going to non-functional. Of course, part of that story at a fence line is that cattle tend to keg up against a fence, but still, the difference between the inside and outside was glaring, and it helped people become motivated to do something different, something better, and yet we recognized that we just couldn't put exclosures everywhere. So what could we do? And then, the other thing about an exclosure fence is that it doesn't stop the problems from the outside from coming up in. In this case, we've got a head cut that can go right through the fence and take out the inside of the exclosure, or in this case, it looks like the other pasture, the adjacent pasture. So fences don't stop hydrologic processes, either floods or sediment coming down from above or head cuts coming up from below. So then they began doing riparian grazing management phases. I remember actually my first riparian excursion in the Elko district in the fall of '84. Bill Platt, a Forest Service fisheries biologist, was by that time doing research on grazing systems and their relationship to riparian grazing, or to riparian systems and fish habitat. He was a fisheries biologist, and he pointed out on this trip that we can graze riparian areas. And I thought, now that's interesting that a fisheries biologist would choose to say that. In fact, he said we can increase the amount of forage we harvest in riparian areas without damaging fish and wildlife habitat. And he at that time was using a classification. They had learned a lot from doing their studies across the Great Basin and Region 4 of the Forest Service. But he said that we're not using everything we've learned, and if we don't use what we've learned, the public is not going to let us graze riparian areas. And I thought, what a great sort of model for me as a young aspiring assistant professor to use as a justification for going out and trying to learn everything I could about these systems, to understand the systems so that we'd know how to manage them properly, so that we could accomplish what various people might want. So through time, through Bill Platt's work and the work of others, we've tried a lot of different grazing systems, which is either the season of use to graze an area or the rotation of the season of use through a series of years in when we graze an area. And there's rationale for many, if not most, maybe all of these systems. They all can work in one place or another. None of them is a panacea, but the movement of animals that's suggested by most of these is fundamentally important. And so we'll talk more about that. Grazing at times of the year other than the hot season, the July, August time period when we know livestock tend to go to riparian areas and really concentrate there, and when the plants are less able to recover because there's not very much growing season left, that's a problem. So mixing things up, moving animals around, that's a much better approach. And so Carol has been involved in putting most of these systems in various places. And because she's been monitoring as well, you see the white tablet there next to the creek. It has in it the location and the date and various other kinds of information so that these photographs can be cataloged and maintained. She's got thousands of them in the district office that tell a story about the wonderful things that can happen. Most of these are not about exclosures. They are about a change in management, and that change in management allows the riparian vegetation to have an opportunity to recover and to thrive, to use its leaf area to be able to photosynthesize, to grow new leaves and to grow roots, and for those stems and leaves and roots underground to provide the kinds of functions that we've spoken about today. She talks about being in some of these areas and saying, I have to take a picture here because I know that this can get to be so much better in the future. And then these photographs show the kind of dramatic recovery that a change in management has allowed to happen. Just remarkable changes from one point in time to another. All these are of the same place, from one point in the series to the next. And here's the system on Indian Jack Creek that we saw earlier. When they changed the management, they began to see some good things happen. They put in a utilization cage to measure or to manage on the basis of utilization and monitor, but you can tell that they weren't using the utilization cage properly because it appears in several photos, and if you don't move those every year, you're not measuring utilization with them. In this case, they were able to use it for monitoring sediment accumulation. 2006, in that spring flow, we had tremendous high water, and the functions of the riparian vegetation slowing that high water allowed the sediment deposition, the building of the floodplains, and a lot of sediment happened. It looked sort of like a disaster, but by golly, within a few years, the plants had grown up through that sediment and had continued to hair over the bottom of that valley, and we had a very robust recovery. So the sediment deposition is a part of what riparian plants are adapted to. And so things have changed. When you graze annually in the spring, though, you sometimes have problems with the uplands, but if you graze in the hot season, you generally have problems in the riparian areas. So the best thing for whole landscapes is to have a grazing system that works across the whole landscape. She points out the need to be adaptive because streams change and the environment changes. We certainly have more carbon dioxide. A lot of data says that we have warming conditions. We have a difference perhaps in the seasonality or the amount of the snowpack. Those things are going to make a difference. And the two of those is interactive. Carol is speculating that we may have more ability to grow willows, perhaps because of the carbon dioxide, perhaps because it's the change in management. But throughout the Elko district, they're seeing a lot more woodies increasing, and things are warming up. But we're also seeing catastrophic fires, or at least extremely large fires, mega fires. We have elk in the country now in places where we did not have elk a few decades ago. We've also got a lot of non-native invasive plants and a few aquatic invertebrates and other species, invasive or non-native fish have been a major problem. I remember in the Lahontan cutthroat trout recovery plan, it was the major problem for Lahontan cutthroat trout. The political environment is also changing, and you know that's changing in both directions. The good things that have been happening on the ground has allowed the political environment for riparian grazing management to be tremendously better in the Elko district over the decades, because people can see that this is not about dividing the pie up differently, it's about expanding the pie. With the increase in willows, Carol is seeing an increase in beaver activity. But lately we've had quite a bit of drought. The interesting thing about drought that I was told decades ago is that it can help with riparian recovery, but it certainly puts a stress on the social systems and the agricultural systems. And yet in the drought of the last few years, a lot of people have been amazed at the kind of water capture that Carol is showing, in part with beaver dams that she has found. But when you develop the sponge, you can store the water, and having that water stored makes it available in times when it would not otherwise be available for livestock as well as for fish and other kinds of human uses. So this is a fascinating series of photos that shows how a system can change. Once you grow the willows, then the beavers can come, and with the beavers you can store the water, and with the water standing water, you have an opportunity to capture sediment and build the system up, and eventually your ponds fill up and you turn them into a marsh and then a wet meadow, and have a stream going by it. So for a while it looked like we changed it from a lotic to a lentic system, but eventually it changed itself back into a lotic system, and it looks like a lotic system. It always was a lotic system, but for a while it had beaver ponds in it, and it looked quite a bit different. So as Carol summarizes the sum total of what she knows, which is a gross understatement, what you should do is mix up the seasons of use. It's not the impact, it's the recovery. The mix up the seasons of use is because plants do different things at different times of the year. Animals go different places and they eat different plants at different times of the year. And so by mixing it up, you provide an opportunity for the plants to do everything they need to do throughout their life cycle, one year or another, and for different plants to get ahead of the game because they're not the ones favored at that particular time of the year. She also recommends being adaptive because things are not staying the same. They're changing a lot from place to place. And you have to be able to, whatever you want to do has to be doable for the people on the ground. And that is both the landowners and the agency people. They have to be able to get the paperwork accomplished that allows it. In the agencies, the rancher has to be able to economically do it and do it with the labor force that they have. And so if you keep pushing on the idea that there needs to be a win-win solution and you keep being hard on the problem and working together to do it, you can find these win-win solutions, and she's found those for many, many different places, and it's exciting what she's found. Of course, as she's been doing that work, she's had a lot of partners. The university has been part of that, but lots of other partners. The various ranches, the mining companies, Trout Unlimited, and Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nevada Department of Wildlife, all these entities working together, Fish and Wildlife Foundation, because we all want the same things. And when we work together to get those things, we find that we're willing to support each other to make things happen on the ground. Recently, Carol has been very interested in telling this story on a bigger scale than she can with individual site photographs, and so she's working with people to use remote sensing. And in this case, they found that they increased their riparian vegetation by 816 acres on the Maggie Creek watershed restoration area. That's a pretty impressive amount of country, especially when you think that those acres are the most valuable habitat, perhaps, in the whole watershed, or at least a very valuable habitat. They're also very valuable for capturing and storing water, for capturing and storing soil carbon or carbon dioxide in general. They've got a great deal more stream impoundment from beavers. Ponding action increased by 9 miles, according to studies. She's found that in the Maggie Creek Basin, there have been a number of changes from 2006 to 10. The stream bar decreased from the bar area decreased by 121 acres. The riparian water in the riparian corridor increased by 466 acres. The percent marsh increased by 26 acres. The length of the stream with water and marsh increased by 7 miles, and the transition acres by 782 acres. So big things happening on a big scale. On a small scale, it is creating the kinds of habitats and conditions that just get people excited. And storing water, building the sponge back, using the physical functions to cause the system to get better. These riparian areas, once they're restored, can also serve a larger landscape scale. Here's a few miles of the riparian area that served as the fuel break, the fire break that stopped the fire after the fires in 2012. Similar stories over on Susie Creek. It looked like a pretty bare, raw, eroding gully back when we had season-long continuous grazing. And then when we changed up the management, we got, so I went a little too fast there, let me go back one. We got some things to happen, and they just keep happening. Once the vegetation comes back, then the sponge gets better, and the woodies grow, and the beavers come, and the sponge gets bigger, and so forth. So they're doing this remote sensing project with Trout Unlimited on Susie Creek, and in Susie Creek, in their Over the past 20 to 30 years, they've had their riparian vegetation increased by 100 acres. Beaver dams went from 0 to 139. Open water increased by 20 acres. Length of water, wetted stream increased by 3 miles, and 32% increase in photosynthetic activity, including excluding the precipitation and the fire effects. So pretty exciting. There's a well that they've been using to monitor water elevation there on Susie Creek, and what they find is that they're storing more water as their riparian area is getting better. And of course, that water was being stored right on through a drought. It's important for a variety of critters. I remember being out on the side of, I think it was Maggie Creek a few years ago when we watched a mink down inside what had been a bare raw gully. Here's a photograph of a sandhill crane nest, and their sort of charismatic megafauna. We had the wildfire photo earlier. The occurrence of wildfire during the 1991 to 2001 fire season played a non-influential role in the response of selected stream survey attributes when coupled with livestock grazing attributes. So Daldorf was one of my students, and actually it was the 99 to 2001 fires that she studied, and what we found is that the resilience of riparian areas to wildfire was pretty substantial, and had a general net increase in their condition. But some livestock grazing definitely made that better than others. The livestock grazing that provided more opportunity for recovery periods was more effective for allowing those riparian systems to get better. There's Susie Creek in 2012, and of course the cool thing about that is that this is the fall time of the year, and there's lots of feed down there for these cows to be able to graze, and by grazing it in the way that they're grazing it, they're not having a harsh impact on the system. They may even be having positive impacts on the system, but the rancher loves it because there's an extra forage source there, and there's a water source there. Forage and water are sometimes hard to match up in the fall of the year. And yet, in spite of all of that, there are challenges in this changing reality of the social situation. There are some people out there who do not understand that livestock can be managed and maintain functions, and either they're continuing to manage livestock in such a way that they're not maintaining functions, or they're dead set against having livestock at all. Sometimes we get litigation that blocks things on either side of that question. There's a tremendous lack of range staff in agency offices these days. Numbers have been cut by about half, plus an awful lot of their time is tied up doing paperwork, so they're not able to get to the field nearly as much as they did at the beginning of my career. There's a lot of internal processes. There's a lot of staff turnover. Perhaps people aren't as satisfied when they have the kind of career that is fraught with litigation and paperwork as opposed to managing real ecosystems out in the field. Accountability could be an issue. She used to have politics and money on this list as challenges, but she's scratched both of those off because she's found that because we're making the pie bigger, the local politics have shifted. And when she wants to do things, money is not an obstacle anymore because making these systems better just gets people excited. So life is good in some ways and yet pretty frustrating and challenging in others. So her solutions: maximize opportunities on the private. The best waters in the state are on private land. The ones that most need riparian functions are on private land. So work with the private landowners, and many of them, now that they understand what can happen, really want those things to happen on private land. She also works with partnerships and the collaboration kind of process. Make improvements within the existing permit is, I think, a very exciting idea. If we've got permits that allow season-long grazing, that doesn't mean in any particular area we have to do season-long grazing. And so we can shorten up the period of grazing by concentrating animals and then allowing a longer recovery period. and that recovery period, it's the recovery, not the impact, really makes a huge difference. And then, of course, she's excited about people like yourselves who take your time to attend events like this to learn more about the system. She's often commented about our Nevada team helping to facilitate the whole social process because people understand what it is we're trying to accomplish to increase the physical functioning of these systems so that they can provide the many values that we all care about. So that's Carol's story. I'm just the mouthpiece. I can do that a little bit because I've watched her do it through the years, but also because I've watched her do the slides several times. And but it's her story. Any questions that I might be able to answer about her story?